tonight. Yes, ma'am.
I thought we were done with that.
We are. I told you I was going to do like a addendum. Remember, it was what was that we called last week? The addendum. So, epilogue. Yeah, that's what it was. The epilogue. Y'all.
That means we're adding to.
Okay. We're not going to add to Acts. After Acts, okay. Paul after Acts. Back to 1. No, we did that last week. We went back to 1:8. Remember we talked about that last week. Oh, anyway, welcome tonight. Thank y'all for being here. This is the after Acts story, Paul after Acts. So technically it's not really Acts. It's going to be more of what happened after Acts. And tradition tells us that he was executed by beheading around 64 or 65 AD. But what happened from the time we last see him in Acts, which we're going to read here in just a minute, kind of refresh our minds where we saw him last week, to the time whenever he dies or is executed, that's kind of what we're talking about tonight. So what happened during those 2 to 2.5 years of time that is not really recorded in the Scriptures what he did, unless you look real deep. And so we're going to try to put all those pieces together and figure that out by looking at some of the other Scriptures and also some tradition and some history. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going to look at tonight. And hopefully this will kind of wrap things up for us, kind of get us, even though it's not really fair because, even though we've been talking about Paul a lot, Acts is not just about Paul, it's about a bunch of other people too. But we're going to, I just thought it'd be interesting because we really don't see where it ends up. And tonight we will even get an indication of what happened to Peter at the same time. So, which we know he died as well.
Yeah, but Paul's a goat.
That's right. That's true. He is. And we could probably all agree with that. All right. Since he wrote pretty much the majority of the New Testament, didn't he? Peter got his due, but, he got to be the one that started it all off with the preaching and the church and all, and seeing all those souls baptized. But Paul was definitely one who really, without Paul and his ministry, we wouldn't have the majority of the New Testament. So that's a pretty astounding fact. All right, so we're going to get started with it. Thank you again for joining us. If you're joining us online or coming across this, we're just wrapping up what we kind of looked where Paul, as we take off from Acts. And we're going to read Acts chapter 28, verse 30, kind of a refresher to find out where he was right here at the end. It says, "Then Paul dwelt 2 whole years in his own rented house and received all who came to him." It sounds like a real wonderful life. He's renting his house. He's, setting up house and all. But we remember he was chained to a Roman guard 24/7. Okay, everywhere he went, the Roman guard went. So this would not be comfortable if you were bathing or having to, excuse yourself in the restroom, whatever. He was always with this guy, and I'm sure it wasn't very comfortable for the guards, but it was just a part of their life as well, and it's what he was done. So this was happening, going on from about 80, 60 to 62 AD. So it was that 2-year period he was there, renting that house arrest. People were coming and going and seeing him. And this is whenever he would have had that ministry of preaching and teaching, as well as a little bit of a writing ministry that took place here. He would have more than likely wrote part of the Corinthian letters. He would have written a lot of the prison epistles. He would have written then, so Philippians, Colossians, Galatians, Ephesians, those letters he would have written. And maybe he would have written some of the other books as well. So from 60 to 62 AD, that's where he was on house arrest. Now in 62, we find out that he was released, or tradition tells us that he was released from prison. And perhaps he was released due to the fact that he was innocent. Remember, he had already been really declared innocent by 3 high-ranking Roman officials, right? 3 governors had already said, I don't find anything wrong with, see you've done anything wrong. And remember what they told him? If you hadn't appealed to Caesar, we would let you go. So perhaps he was released because Nero was like, I don't see anything, I don't really have anything to hold you against. Or, remember we talked about last week, as we were wrapping up that last chapter, that when Paul was talking to the Jewish leaders there in Rome, they said, we haven't even heard anything about, any accusations against you. We haven't heard any wrongdoings against you. But we have heard about this sect, and we want to know about that. We know that is all over the place. And so it already reached to Rome, at least the sect of Christianity. So perhaps the 2 years, which would have been a statutory period whereby you can hold somebody for 2 years. After 2 years, you can't be held liable if no one shows up to witness against you. So perhaps after 2 years of no one showing up, and we don't know if the Jews showed up or not from Jerusalem or any other region, perhaps no one showing up, they finally said, okay, no one showed up against you, there's nothing to hold you, so we're just going to release you. But again, there's nothing that says one way or the other reason why he was released. But we do have 2 historians. One is a Greek historian, one is a Christian historian. They're both from about the turn of the century, the turn of the 2nd century into the 3rd century. So Eusebius, writing around 300 AD, says this. After pleading his cause, he is said to have been sent again upon the ministry of preaching. Now, it's talking about Paul. He said, he pleading his cause before who? Nero. Okay, he's talking about, that's what he would have been referring to there. After pleading his cause before Nero, he's released. Now, Nero didn't send him out to do his preaching. Nero just sent him, released him. But Paul went out to go about preaching. That's what he would have done. He wasn't going to stop being Paul. Okay, we've seen what he was done before. He was going to go back to doing whatever he did before. Jerome is this other Christian historian, scholar, during that turn of the 3rd, the 4th century, writes in 392 AD that at the end of his imprisonment, this is what he says, Paul was dismissed by Nero that the gospel of Christ might be preached also in the West. Now again, Jerome is just saying that the reason why Paul, or God, allowed Paul to be released is so that God can continue to use Paul to take the gospel into the western region. Now, so that points us to the fact that Paul went west. If Paul was in Rome, what is west of Rome? West of Rome, or Italy, is the Aegean Sea, and around the other side of the Aegean Sea is Spain. So Paul would have gone to Spain. And that's where we see him having this ministry in Spain in the year AD 62. Upon his release, Paul would have ended up finding himself in Spain, preaching there in fulfillment of his wish expressed in Romans 15:24. He says this in Romans 15:24. He says, whenever I journey to Spain, I shall come to you, for I hope to see you on my journey and to be helped on my way there by you, if first I may enjoy your company for a while. So Paul was talking to who in Romans? Who's he talking to? He's talking to those Christians that are scattered throughout Rome, right? We call it the Church of Rome, but it's really those who are all over that region of Rome that are scattered about. He writes to them. That's, if you go look in Romans, that's kind of what he was writing to. And so he's speaking to all these believers in that region. He says, when I come to you, when I journey to Spain. So he had plans to go there, and perhaps this was his mission, and now he is going into Spain. Clement, the Bishop of Rome, in the 1st century, 88 and 99 AD, says this. After preaching both to the east and west, he gained the illustrious reputation due to his faith, having taught righteousness to the whole world and come to the extreme limit of the west and suffered martyrdom under the perfects or given his testimony before the rulers. So martyrdom of the perfects means that he died as a result of those who were in charge, Caesar, the governor, not Caesar, the king, who would have been Nero. So this is somebody who is a bishop in Rome during that first century who writes about Paul that he went about teaching into the western region and to the extreme limits of the West. Extreme limits of the West, if you look at a map, would have been far into Spain, right? Because Rome would have been on this side, so extreme limits would have been Spain, because after that, it's the ocean. And then you're going over into our neck of the woods, right? Getting on into the North America. So that would have been the extreme limits, and so one can only conclude that Paul had this ministry throughout Spain. Now, we know from Scripture he had a ministry surrounding this Aegean Sea, which is that sea that separates Spain and Italy, that whole body of water there. He had various ministries there among various cities, because we find that throughout the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, those are called the pastoral epistles or letters to the pastors, because Timothy was a pastor and Titus was a pastor. They seem to have been written after Paul's Roman imprisonment. So these letters that he was writing to these pastors were after his Roman imprisonments. But they offer some clues to his activities that may have taken place during those years of the 62, really into the 64 period. So even though it's not listed here, but it would have been even listed into the 64 period. So 2 Timothy was definitely written from the Roman prison, when he was in that maritime prison in the dungeon in the year of his death. So 64 or 65 is whenever he would have written 2 Timothy, because of the context of that book, which we'll get into in a little bit. You'll know by the tone of what he's saying that he is not expecting to live very much longer. But notice 1 Timothy 1:3. Listen to this. 1 Timothy 1:3. As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine. So he's writing to Timothy. This is 1 Timothy 1, verse 3. And he says he's going into Macedonia, or he went into Macedonia. So that Macedonia is one of those cities on the Aegean Sea. And then 1 Timothy 3, 14 and 15, and the second part of verse 15 says this, or the first part of verse 15 says, these things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly, but if I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God. So he's talking about, he's wanting to come to Timothy in Ephesus, another one of those cities on the Aegean Sea. I'm wanting to come to you, but if I'm delayed, I want you to know that may be a possibility. Then in Titus 1:5, he says, for this reason I left you in Crete. Again, another one of those cities on the Aegean Sea, that you should set in order the things that are lacking and appoint elders in every city as I commanded you. And again in Titus 3:12, when I send Artemas to you and Tychicus, to be diligent to come to me at Nicopolis, for I have decided to spend the winter there. And then in 2 Timothy 4:20, Erastus stayed in Corinth, but Trophimus I have left in Miletus sick. So we see, kind of, you follow these along, you'll see that he went to Corinth, he went to Ephesus, he went to Nicopolis, he went to Miletus, he went to Crete, he went to all these various cities along the Aegean Sea that he was visiting. Now, he wouldn't have just gone there as like a sightseeing tour. He would have been doing ministry. He would have been preaching. He would have been, helping build up the believers there and encourage those in the faith. So he had this ministry over that 2-year period during the writing of these pastoral epistles, which he wrote more than likely probably at the end of his life toward the time when he was back in prison, writing about the things he had done during that 2-year period, which kind of goes off the map. We don't really see him or have any record of what he did. Then there's something very interesting happens the month of July in 64 AD. We have Rome catches on fire. This is a recorded event in history. The fires begin near the Roman Circus, and they burn about half the city in about less than a week's time. So in 6 days, the city is burnt down. Out of the 14 districts of Rome, only 4 of them survive, and of the surviving cities, most are just left with just rubble, just kind of charred remains are left. And so it is just a severe tragedy for the people and those who dwell in that region. Now, according to the Roman historian Tacitus, 56 to 120 AD, the public believes that the fires are a result of an order by Nero, that he literally set the place on fire. That he did it. But, you know, that's what they believe. But according to what he penned, listen what he says. This is his record of what took place back during that time, 64 AD. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most inquisitive tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. And most mischief, superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea through the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful, even in every part of the world, find their center and become popular. I thought that was pretty funny. And that you know, they're talking about how bad Christians are, but it's right here in Rome when all this stuff breaks out. And that's where everything bad comes from. It all becomes popular right there. He keeps on going. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hated against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths, covered with skins of beasts. They were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, were doomed to flames and burnt to serve as nightly illuminations when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion. For it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. So this is a historian talking about, you know, what he had kind of observed or had researched and had thought was the case that happened back then, and we have it in the historical record, and that's what took place. So, knowing that now Christians are being hunted down, Christians are being, examined, arrested, and now being tried and convicted, this is when most historians believe, most scholars believe, that would have been arrested. Really arrested the first time, kind of appeal to Caesar, right? Now 64, maybe the first part of 65, he would have been arrested and placed in that maritime prison. Now this would have been a dungeon type prison. Before, he was on house arrest. He had his house. He paid for this house. He would have been able to go in and out. He would have been able to receive guests. He would have been able to, enjoy life a bit during that 2 years. But now, this is a very dark, damp place. What we're told, I understand, is that prisoners would be lowered down through a small opening into a hole, basically, in the ground. And so the only access they would have to the outside world would be like a little small opening in the top. There wasn't a lot of room to move around in there. And this would have been his holding cell to the day that they took him out of there to die. So he couldn't climb out because he had to lower him down in there. And it was too high to climb out, and yet, the only space he had was the little hole at the top. But it would have been through that hole he could have gotten, communications, and he could have passed on letters that he wrote, because we know it was in this hole that more than likely he wrote 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and it was in this, definitely he wrote 2nd Timothy in this hole, and that's where he would have sent that letter by the hands of a messenger or courier, if you will, to Timothy. And so we got his arrest, and then we notice his loneliness. And you begin to see this. By the way, there's no scripture record of his arrest, only tradition. Only do we have tradition. But we do have this, and I want to go back. Let me go back. Let me go back to this, to his arrest. Because I wanted to say, Paul writes this as he's in this dungeon, and this comes from 2 Timothy 1:8. He says, "Therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but share with me in the sufferings for the gospel according to the power of God." Now, the reason why, or I should say, why do you think he's writing to Timothy in such words? Don't be scared. Why do you think he's writing to Timothy?
Well, your word got out the way that he was treated.
Yeah. So, we're only talking about on the other side of the sea is Timothy in Ephesus. If Timothy's over here in Ephesus, he's over here in Rome, or that region of Rome, somewhere in Spain, then, or maybe in Spain. We don't really know where he was when he was arrested. But when he's arrested, he's no doubt brought back to Rome, where he's going to spend his time in this Roman prison. The word gets out. He doesn't want his young pastor, Timothy, to get afraid. He doesn't want him to get scared. He wants him to remain faithful, to remain strong. Because it could be that Timothy is arrested. It could be that any other Christian is sought down and arrested. Probably not, because he's kind of in a different area, different country, if you will. He's not in Italy. But it could be that he could get arrested, so he wants to make sure that he is preparing him for what will come, preparing him for possible suffering. Notice what he says in 2 Timothy 2, verse 3. He says, "You therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." He talks about him enduring that hardship. So it's quite clear that Paul, at least in his mind, thought that Timothy may be the next person to experience this kind of suffering. And so kind of preparing him. Notice kind of Paul's mind, his mindset, his state of mind, as he is approaching the end of his life. He's asking Timothy to come visit him. In 2 Timothy 4:19, which we talked about, this would have been written toward the end of his life. He says this, verses 9 to 16. "Be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas has forsaken, having loved this present world, and has departed." And the books, especially and the coppersmith, did me much harm. May the Lord repay him according to his works. You also must beware of him, for he has greatly resisted our words. At my first defense no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them. Man, he's kind of sounding sad right now, isn't it? It's kind of a sad state of affairs. He said, listen, all these people have left me. And the people that didn't leave me did me wrong, right? And now I'm left all here by myself. And I'm all, no one is with me. No one's on my side. The only person he's got with him is Luke. I don't think Luke's in the prison with him. He's not in the dungeon with him. But Luke is available. Luke is more than like maybe one of those people who's getting the letters and being that kind of go-between, taking the things that maybe Paul messages back and forth and being his liaison to the outside world. But this is Paul's state of mind. He goes on to talk about being ready to be poured out as a drink offering and the time of his departure being at hand in chapter 4, verse 6. He talks about in verse 7, he said, I've fought the good fight. I've kept the faith. I've finished the course. It's all in that little discourse he's talking to Timothy. He talks about in verse 8, he's looking forward to the crown of life that the Lord will give to all those that have proven their love for God. And so he's kind of stating these terms, and we've read through these passages before, and we read through them as Christians, and we think, man, this is Timothy. I mean, this is Paul, talking to us as Christians. But you got to understand, this is Paul in a very lonely place of life, realizing I'm not leaving here alive. This is it for me. I'm not coming out of this hole or out of this dungeon to be set free. This is the end of my life. It would have been in here where he would have written, the rest of his epistles, the rest of his letters to the church at Corinth. He would have encouraged them. This is where he would have written things like, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. Those kind of things. Talking about being faithful to the end and not giving up on the Lord. And so this is a place where Paul is, and he spends the remainder of his life in this prison. Hear about his death. Again, Paul died around the end of 65. We referred to him earlier, that Greek. After a second visit to the talking about Paul in his life as a martyr for Christ. So his life was taken from him. Jerome writes, he then in the 14th year, the same day with Peter, was beheaded at Rome for Christ's sake and was buried in the Ostian way, the 27th year after our Lord's. Now, Jerome's dating would be off a little bit, since Nero reigned between 54 to 68 A.D. of Paul being beheaded by Nero is pretty down, and most scholars. We can see that he had this ministry, that he left Rome, he left Italy, and he went to the farthest regions of Spain, and he had this ministry around the Aegean Sea during that 2-year time that he was writing most of his letters, the books of the New Testament. He definitely wrote several of those books or letters in that dungeon prison where he spent the remainder of his life. That's where he was brought out to die. Now, I don't know what it was like when Paul died, whenever, he was beheaded. But I can only imagine that as he was being led to the that the whole way down there as the executioner had never been the same. And so definitely Paul was an inspiring figure, inspiring for all of us to be able to stand strong. And like the words that we read now as we read through the rest of the New Testament, as we're reading through those books of the Bible, and we come across these books that Paul has written, and as we're reading them, hopefully through the Acts study, we've learned about Paul, kind of seeing how he endured through his life and the end of his life. We can kind of keep that as a backdrop to when, so we can put a little context. Certainly that should inspire us to do as well. Because times will be hard for us. We will. Christians will be side of the persecuted in the far eastern side of the world right now. Right? In the eastern part of the world, they've been persecuted for years and still are being persecuted now. Is Back when Jesus was walking today, when Paul was walking today, and all those guys we read, and ladies and men and women we read about in Fox's Book of Martyrs, all those same people, throughout the centuries have been persecuted. They're still being persecuted. Jews, Gentile alike. But it could happen, and it could come this way. And when it comes this way, hopefully the writings of people like Paul and Peter and these guys, John, and these others who've been really just champions for our faith, for the faith, hopefully their faithfulness will inspire us to remain faithful no matter. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and close out tonight with prayer, and thank you again for joining us, and for Paul after Acts. And hopefully you can be inspired as well by those stories. If you have a prayer request you'd like to share with us, we encourage you to leave it in the comment section below the video, or let us know by going to our website, riveroakcc.org/pray, and we would unite with you in prayer over those things that you have upon your heart. And don't forget, take time to visit there and pray for others if you have a minute. It's always a good thing to do. And if you can click on that little prayer icon, and I believe if the person has enabled it, it'll notify them that you prayed for them, which is always a blessing. Could be an encouragement to somebody in a very difficult time of need. All right, so we're going to take requests now and say goodbye to our online audience. Thank you. We'll see you again in person real soon.